everyone, and welcome to Nimonik Insights. With me today is Una Jefferson, who's a regulatory analyst with Nimonik. By now, you must be very familiar with her. She brings you the latest news in EHS that's trending in US, Canada, or global. Today, she's going to talk about the new regulations related to methane emissions that came into force in Canada. So she's going to talk about which ones, whether the provincial or the federal ones, take effect, and what are the factors that are taken into account when deciding which regulations would be taken into effect. So welcome, Una.
Thank you for having me.
So Una, let's just dive right into it. So what are the regulations that were passed recently in April?
So the federal government passed a set of regulations concerning methane emissions in the oil and gas industry. And these are kind of meant to address the methane reduction goal that was set as part of the Pan-Canadian Framework for Clean Growth and Climate Change. They set a goal of reducing methane emissions in the oil and gas industry by 45% from 2012 levels by 2025. And so these regulations are supposed to bring them closer to that. And the regulations they address emissions overall, but also monitoring and reporting requirements.
Sure. And is it conflicting with the existing provincial regulations?
Well, yes. Yes. Short answer, yes. I guess the reason that this is a news story of some interest is that 2 days before the federal regulations were passed, the Alberta Energy Regulator released a new set of draft directives, and these draft directives also concerned methane emissions in the oil and gas industry. And they alleged these two sets of regulations, or these two sets of rules, have similar goals, because the Alberta has also set a methane emission reduction goal for the oil and gas industry. They want to reduce, it's very similar, but they want to reduce emissions by, I believe, 45% from 2014 levels by 2025. But if you look at the content of the draft directives, they are different from the federal regulations. And so the question is, this seems like a situation in which the provincial government and federal government might try to negotiate an equivalency agreement. This has been much discussed, and so I thought that this would be a good moment to talk about how is equivalency decided? How has it been decided in the past, and what does that mean?
So, before we dive into that, Would you like to explain how exactly are they different, or how is the Alberta and the federal, how are they different, the regulations?
Sure. I think generally, well, just to give a quick rundown, they concern emissions from both intentional emissions, where oil and gas operations get rid of methane into the atmosphere through what's called venting or flaring, and then also unintentional emissions, so through, for example, leaks from faulty equipment. And so, in general, I would say that the federal regulations are more stringent in their limits on intentional releases, and they also are more prescriptive in their monitoring and reporting requirements, and repair requirements for unintentional emissions.
Okay.
So they basically provide more exact rules saying, for this type of equipment, you need to monitor this many times a year. I think they require 3 times a year checkups for unintentional emissions, whereas the provincial rules allow certain types of facilities to do it only once a year, things like that.
So, seems like the provincial offer more flexibility to the industry.
Yes, and that is explicitly stated in kind of the little introductory piece from the Alberta Energy Regulator. This was heavily advocated for by the Canadian Association of Petroleum Producers. They had a wish list of, related to flexibility. They really wanted to be able to find their own way to reductions. And the Alberta Energy Regulator, the draft directives, they don't go quite so far, but they are kind of more veering towards allowing industry flexibility to determine their route.
Okay. So when are the directives coming into force?
So these directives, they're currently in draft form. But I read one analysis from Norton Rose Fulbright, I believe, saying that they would likely come into force at the end of 2018.
And how about the federal ones?
So the federal ones, they've been passed, and they would come into force, I believe, in 2020.
So in 2020, which ones, how would they decide which ones would be the ones that would be applicable to Alberta?
Right. So it still remains to be seen what will happen with these draft directives. If it happens that the provincial government and the federal government decide to enter negotiations as to whether these rules are equivalent. I'll provide a bit of context. So, basically, the federal regulations are made under the Canadian Environmental Protection Act. And this act, it has a provision, which says that if there are equivalent provincial rules in place for certain types of provisions under the Canadian Environmental Protection Act. So this includes provisions related to environmental emergencies, provisions related to regulating toxic substances, of which greenhouse gases are included in that category. So basically, the Canadian Environmental Protection Act provides for the federal government to exempt a province. It can also be a territory or a indigenous jurisdiction. They can exempt that jurisdiction from federal rules if it's determined that they have equivalent provisions in place.
Okay, yeah. So in 2020, how do they decide equivalency? It might sound a little bit technical, but I'm quite curious to know how they decide whether they're equivalent or not.
Yeah, so there are two ways we can look at that. The actual text of the legislation that provides for it, they say, it has to have equivalent provisions that lead to outcomes that are equivalent, like outcomes of interest. So in this case, equivalent emissions reductions. Also, there's a requirement in the legislation that the jurisdiction have basically a provision for citizens to request investigation of offenses under the rules, and also provisions for citizens to follow that investigation. And there are also government documents say that there's also a requirement for equivalent monitoring and enforcement and penalties. And then if we look at we can also figure out what the important factors are by looking at the history of what equivalency agreements have been signed in the past. So I think there's only 2 existing ones, so it's quite a quick history. There's one that is quite old, between Alberta and Canada, which concerns pulp and paper effluent. And then there was one that was signed quite recently between Nova Scotia and the federal government, where Nova Scotia is exempted from, I believe, their 2012 federal rules concerning carbon dioxide emissions from coal-powered electricity generation. And basically the Nova Scotia government, they received an exemption from these federal rules because they negotiated that they could keep a certain number of coal plants open in exchange for provisions to increase the amount of renewable energy in their electricity market, and also to improve the performance of certain among their coal plants, and many, kind of a package of measures. And it was determined by the federal government that the emissions reductions would overall be equivalent. And they also did kind of a cost benefit analysis in dollars. Yeah.
Perfect. So now we know that the new federal rules have been passed. They would come into force in 2020. But meantime, Alberta has its own regulations, which are in draft form, which might be passed by 2018.
Yeah.
And then if they have to enter a negotiation for equivalency, and then if they are able to prove that they're equivalent, then if the provincial rules apply to Alberta, the oil and gas industry would have more flexibility in reducing the methane emissions. But if the federal rules apply, if they consider that it's not equivalent, then they would have to go into stricter monitoring as prescribed by the federal regulations.
Yeah, exactly. And it's worth saying that, yeah, generally the way these things have gone, definitely in the case of Nova Scotia, is that an equivalency agreement, yes, it gives more flexibility. One thing that's interesting is that you have the Nova Scotia agreement and then another agreement which is currently being negotiated between Saskatchewan and the federal government for the same regulations. And in both cases, it is the basically the provincial power authority gets certain concessions to keep, coal plants open, for example. And then they also have requirements. And it's interesting in this case because it's a bit different. The oil and gas industry, there's not one power authority that owns all the oil exploration and production, for example. So it's a different case, and it'll be interesting to see how this turns out.
Well, thank you so much, Una. It's been an interesting topic, and I hope the listeners have a better idea now about how these rules apply and what are the things that are taken into account. We'll be back next week. If you're listening to this episode before the June the 5th, then I would like to invite you to attend a webinar on indoor and outdoor air monitoring. The experts are Malak Risk and Jean-Philippe Maffei. And if you're listening to this episode after June 5, then do listen to the webinar recording. Still, it's available under the webinar section on the website. They share a lot of information on how to on the legislation trends, on how whether the legislation is getting stricter, which it seems like it is getting stricter, and also on the various devices which are there, which you can use for outdoor and indoor monitoring, and also the things that you need to keep into account while choosing an air monitoring device. So that's all for today. Listen to the other podcasts which are there on the list, and we will see you next time with Una again. See you soon. Bye-bye.